Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our third coffee chat session this year. I am Leanne Swanson. I'm the CEO of the National Center for Healthcare Leadership. And welcome everyone. I know we actually have quite a few people joining us for the first time, and then we have a lot who are repeat customers, if you will, and joining us again for this session. I am really looking forward to today's conversation. The topic is courageous allyship, a requirement for advancing diversity and health equity. And I just want to thank Dwayne and Ben for sharing their insights and expertise on this very important topic. And again, thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous moderator, Melanie Standish, and we will get this conversation going. Thanks, Melanie.
Excellent. Thank you, Leanne. For those who don't know me, I'm Melanie Standish, and I am a program manager at the National Center for Healthcare Leadership and our honorary moderator for the Coffee Chat series for this year. It's really my pleasure to introduce Dwayne Reynolds, the founder and CEO of Just Health Collective, and Benjamin Anderson, who is the Vice President of Rural Health and Hospitals at the Colorado Hospital Association. We're going to have an excellent discussion today, specifically related to allyship. How can you use relationship building and listening to bring in others into the health equity conversation? And then what are next steps for leaders moving forward and how you can be involved as an ally and kind of moving this mission? I think in the past year, it's been very clear that diversity, equity, and inclusion is imperative to the healthcare sector. And sometimes for individuals, it's difficult to know where to start and how to get involved as an ally. So we're hoping that our audience members today really leave with some actionable items and hear from a great story into how Dwayne brought Ben into the allyship conversation. So the first thing I'd like you both to do is tell us a bit about yourself and maybe a sentence or two and what work you do in the health equity and inclusion space. Dwayne, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Very excited to be here with you all today. So I have been in the healthcare industry for over 20 years in different capacities. I spent most of the time running practice operations for academic faculty practices, and then I went into management consulting and ultimately started to specialize in the space of inclusion and health equity. So today, I am the president and CEO of Just Health Collective, which is an organization that helps healthcare systems, medical groups, payers.
Let's see, we might have lost Dwayne for a second there. We'll see if he comes back in. Okay, Dwayne, I think you tuned out for a second there.
All right, sorry about that.
So Just Health Collective, what does it specialize in?
We specialize in helping healthcare organizations accelerate their transformation in the health equity and belonging space.
Excellent, thank you. And Ben, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of your work?
Sure, my name's Benjamin Anderson, Vice President for Rural Health and Hospitals, now with the Colorado Hospital Association. I've been here for nearly 2 years, was hired to develop a statewide strategy for rural health with the vision to really close the equity or close the disparity gap between rural and urban Coloradans and develop some capacity building models that could be scaled nationally. Prior to that, I was a scrappy rural hospital CEO in a very remote place in Kansas on the Kansas-Colorado border, where it was among the most remote places in the United States, according to the Washington Post, measured by a distance, driving distance to a city of 75,000 or more, but it was also among the most ethnically diverse places in the United States, as it was just adjacent to the world's largest beef packing plant. So we saw disparities both from an ethnic standpoint and also geographic standpoint, and spent that 10 or 11 years focused on equity through those lenses.
Excellent, thank you. We're really excited to have you both today. And I'm excited because when I first met you both and we chatted, there's this excellent story about how Dwayne brought Ben into the conversation around health equity. And I'm excited to share it with the audience today. So as some context framing, Ben, I'd love you to share how Dwayne brought you into the health equity space and the initial story of how you both met and started building that relationship.
Sure, Melanie, I love this story. I was sitting in my office in Kearney County Hospital in Lakin, Kansas. I'd been there six or so years, and I got a cold call from a guy named Dwayne Reynolds, and he introduced himself and said at the time that he was vice president for the American Hospital Association. He was executive director for its Institute for Diversity and Health Equity. So I later learned the IFDHE, and I hadn't heard of it, and I didn't really know why he was calling me initially, but he said he had, I think, read a story about what we were doing with maternal child equity, and maybe somebody at the AHA had given him a heads up, and he called just to introduce himself, and he said, I want you to be part of the IFDHE board, or part of the IFDHE in some capacity. And I thought a lot of things as Dwayne said that, that didn't come out of my mouth. I was thinking, is this guy aware that I'm a relatively conservative, middle of the road white guy living in the middle of nowhere in Kansas? Like, I didn't think I was invited to this party. Like, I didn't think this was for me. And did he have the right number? Like, I was thinking all kinds of things as he was calling me, because his profile just didn't show up on my caller ID very often. And what came out of my mouth though was, Dwayne, thanks for calling. Why me? And he responded by saying, you know, as health equity has risen to the center of the national conversation over the last 20 or 30 years, it has largely overlooked the disparities between rural and urban America. Essentially, the inclusion movement has excluded rural America. And we've done so to the detriment of this movement. And what he said there really caught me, because it spoke to my pain, because I had been living in rural America. And the reality of serving rural America is that you must become the underserved to do it. To serve the underserved in rural America means you got to become the underserved, because if something doesn't exist, it doesn't matter how much money you have or what your social class is, it just doesn't exist there. And so what he was speaking to really, or what he was mentioning really spoke to me. And the second thing he said was, you know, we tend to, in this work, we tend to villainize white guys that look like you. And we do that also to the detriment of this movement. He said, I don't believe we'll ever achieve equity in this country without buy-in from some white men. And he said, I don't believe guilt. He said, I believe guilt and shame and judgment and blame, they may be powerful emotions and they may affect behaviors for a time, but they don't change hearts. And what we need is heart change. What we need is a movement. And so rather than shaming you or calling you out for being a white guy, I'm calling you into the most meaningful work of this generation. I'm asking if you have the courage to be the only person who looks like you on a board of 40 people. Do you have the courage to join me? We need you. Because this work, as he said in his Southern tone, this work takes everybody. And he didn't initially have me. I said, you know, I wonder if you'd be willing to come out and see me and see where I live and really see what we deal with on a daily basis. In the back of my mind, I was just really not sure that I was the diversity he was looking for. I just didn't think I fit, you know, that had been ingrained in me just based on how I felt I'd been treated over the previous 10 or 15 years in healthcare delivery. And I'd largely been doing this work by myself. I wanted him to come out and see it. And so he flew 3 people out from the American Hospital Association. They filmed a video on why rural America is important, why it's the backbone of the United States, why it's important that we focus on them as well in the health equity discussion as we focus on everybody. And he posted that on the American Hospital Association's website. And he spoke at a town hall meeting on diversity, equity, and inclusion as a Black guy from Atlanta coming in front of a bunch of ranchers in ball caps and boots and jeans. And then we took him out for a steak dinner and fed him Rocky Mountain oysters, which were essentially breaded, fried bull testicles. And he ate them and smiled, knowing full well what they were, saying, when in Rome, we do what the Romans do. I'm here, I'm showing up, I'm gonna be with you. And he had me, he showed up. And from, I mean, I'm on that board. Dwayne since moved on to the Just Health Collective. We remain good friends, but it was transformative for me. And what I learned through that was, you know, we can share a little bit later on, was that I would have access to so many new resources, knowing that I'm part of the conversation that Dwayne invited me into.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Dwayne, from your perspective, is there anything you would add about taking that step to invite Ben into the conversation or any part of his story?
Yeah, much like Ben said, when I was leading the Institute for Diversity and Health Equity, I have to look across the nation at different hospitals, and different hospitals were on different journeys based off of what their populations were and what their needs were. And, we were doing a good job of engaging hospitals that were, in the fold, but I was concerned with how do we move the hospitals that are in the middle that need us. And understanding the reality is health equity is not about one specific demographic. Now, there are certain demographics that suffer worse in terms of health inequity, but the reality is that health equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion is about all of us. And we have to acknowledge that point if we're actually going to make transformative change. And understanding that the center of power today in our healthcare organizations and broader society still is with white males. It is fact. And knowing that, we have to engage them in a very different way, right? We have to invite them into the conversation to help us deconstruct and rebuild a more just and equitable healthcare system. They have to understand how it impacts them, how it impacts the jobs that they do as leaders in our healthcare organizations. And once they really come to an understanding of the dynamics of systemic racism and unconscious bias and how it plays out, you usually can get folks to buy in and become allies, right? Because, when I think about a particular health equity or health disparity in the opioid crisis, that is really about white males. They're suffering disparities from that perspective. So again, it's about all of us, and we have to bring what today is the center of power to the conversation to help us disrupt where power lies if we're ultimately going to create a more just and equitable healthcare system. And so I reached out to Ben. Yes, it was a cold call. I've been known to do that a lot in my life, but it's about developing relationships and helping him understand where he fit in. That, as a national association, we're concerned about all of our members and how they're evolving and moving. And there was a story to be in his community. They've done a wonderful job of addressing health inequity in that community and really building trust with the large immigrant population that exists in Layton County.
Excellent, thank you. And let's shift the conversation from your amazing story to a broader conversation about, health equity, bringing people in as allies, and really relationship building. Dwayne, I'd love to hear from you specifically. You say this work takes everybody is the line that I took away, and Ben remembers so clearly as well. From your perspective, what needs to be done to bring more allies into the fold, and what is the importance of relationship building in all of that?
Yeah. Well, the relationship building is the key to these challenges, right? We have to understand the various perspectives, frames of reference, lenses that are at play. And all the time will we agree, that's okay. But the important part is that we continue the conversation and we understand the nuance and perspectives of people wherever they're coming from. We have to meet them where they're at and then take them on the journey in order to transform. And so I have always sort of been that person that wants to connect individuals together and to tell the story about how our collective work and support of one another actually helps to lift all boats, right? And if we can focus on that narrative, focus on have points of intersection and points of agreement, work backwards from some of the differences of opinions that we may have. So I really think it is about developing those individual relationships to then be able to impact systemic change.
Excellent. And Ben, from your perspective, I'd love to hear what about Dwayne's approach really brought you in as an ally? What elements of that initial conversation said, okay, I can be a part of this and I can do this work too?
Dwayne Reynolds slept in our guest bedroom. He didn't show up in Lakin. He showed up in my home. He played with my kids. I mean, he just said, I'm in. I'll be part of your family. I as much as you'll allow me to, I'm gonna be in your life. And I saw through it, not just through his words, but his actions, I'm gonna find a way to love you in your language. And if that includes me coming out to this very remote area, which I mean, could have been nerve-wracking for somebody from urban Atlanta. With Dwayne's background, he could have been nervous about coming out there. Just to be frank, a couple of years before Dwayne came there was an attempted bombing in Muslim Somalis by white supremacists who were, you know, they called themselves constitutionalists, but essentially radicals that had tried to, they called themselves the Orkin Men, and they were trying to annihilate an entire city mile in Southwest Kansas full of East African refugees. See, that was all over world news. If I were Dwayne and reading that, I'd be like, where am I coming? Like, where am I coming to? And Dwayne didn't just show up in our community. He showed up in our home and he was part of our family. And when he was leaving, he said, have you ever heard of chitterlings? And I said, you mean chitlins? And he said, you need to come to Atlanta and have some chitlins. And I intend to do that because I think we broke bread together when we were together. And he broke down any stereotype I had in my mind about who Dwayne might be by just showing up and being him. And in doing that, he gave me the privilege of going second by saying, well, gosh, if that's how you're going to be, here's who I am. And I know that you're going to accept me for who I am. And I know more about racial disparities than I ever would have known having not met Dwayne Reynolds. And he did that by first saying, let's talk about rural-urban disparities and let's communicate how important they are. And when I felt like he saw my pain, I responded saying, well, it isn't okay that anybody dies sooner than another person due to their race or their gender or their socioeconomic status or their zip code or their sexual orientation or whatever. It's not okay. So what are we going to do about it? But he invited me into that conversation just through being him and showing up in my home.
And I'd add that, Ben inviting me into his home and giving me the opportunity to break bread is about his humility and vulnerability, right? All have to approach these conversations and these interactions with that type of character, because that will disarm people to be able to find the connection where we can then grow from.
Absolutely. And kind of a follow-up question to you, Ben, I often see things like in order to work in the space, you need to feel uncomfortable. What was that like for you? Was it uncomfortable? How did you deal with that discomfort? And how was that? I'm just interested to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, thanks for acknowledging. I mean, this is a coffee chat full of elephants in the room. We're just going to toss them out there. The relatively conservative white guy being called by this black guy from Atlanta, and breaking down all kinds of stereotypes. But it was a little nerve-wracking because I don't know if Dwayne was a new relationship for me. Dwayne's from Atlanta. I've not spent any time in Atlanta, and Dwayne's from a different cultural background than I am, and all of those things were crossing my mind. But I think I just been on a path to learning that inviting somebody into your home is a simple act of bravery, is a simple act of courage. And in rural America, we're not very good at that. We don't audition for new family members very well in rural America. We like to think we take care of everybody and everybody loves everybody. And you raise the two fingers off the top of the steering wheel and it's like, it's saying hello, but it's like, to a newcomer, that could feel like the middle finger. It's like, I see you and I don't care. And that's the reality for living in rural. And I've been on a journey realizing that, it is uncomfortable to invite somebody into your life, but it's a simple act of bravery. But we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. certainly, if we could have done through our country's history what we've done to protect the freedoms in our country, and if our freedoms are connected to our ability to work together and coexist, certainly I can have somebody in my home and I can get to know them and break bread with them. And so it was nerve-wracking, and I'd say it's worth it.
Excellent. Thank you. You know, one of the things when I was talking to you both is that, Dwayne, you took a huge step by going out to Ben's home, spending time with him. And I think the reality for many is that they want to make change in their organizations. Maybe they don't have time to do that, to be in someone's home. They do have time to maybe get to know them. But I'm curious in terms of the actionable next step for those leaders who are listening to us today. Dwayne, we'll start with you. What would you say is an actionable next step to advance the health equity and inclusion conversation in a leader's organization?
I think the first step is to listen, to have people that are different than you talk about their lived experience. The reality is that most of us, if you think about your circle of trust, the people that surround you, they likely look like you. They likely are around the same age, maybe in the same field. Um, we tend to limit ourselves in terms of the people that we've let into our circle. But what if you could open that circle up a bit? What might it mean in the context of your own personal growth and in the context of learning something to become a more inclusive leader in your organization? We have an obligation now that we have seen what we've seen with health disparities through COVID-19. We can't unsee that. And as healthcare leaders, we have to be invested in creating an equitable healthcare system. So my advice is listen and open up your table to hear the lived experiences of others.
Great. And what about yourself, Ben?
A couple of things to build on what Dwayne's saying. Listening is such an important skill. It's a life skill, and it's also a change management skill. And I think there's twofold. So I think opening up our lives to people who aren't like us. So I think the more we can stretch ourselves, if we voted for Joe Biden, find somebody who voted for Donald Trump. Have coffee with them. If we voted for Donald Trump, find somebody that voted for Joe Biden and have coffee with them. That's an act of courage because it can get explosive, and just focus on things that we can agree on. And what I believe, having done talks in 35 or 40 states, almost all the rural ones, is that most folks, when you get down to it on an individual level, are just good folks. They care about people. When you get them out of the mob, when you get them out of their, their cable news traps and whatever, they're just good folks that care about other folks, and building relationships with those folks. And we'll find that some of the stereotypes that we believe about each other may not be true. And I think the other piece is then to continue to build relationships with our own echo chamber and to say, hey, guess what I learned? Guess what I learned? This really surprised me about this person that I met. And I'll tell you a quick story, Melanie. There's an Indian American medical student from a very prominent medical school in Manhattan, New York, who cold called me and said, hey, I heard about what y'all are doing with maternal child health, and I want to come out and see what you're doing in rural health. And would you host me for a month? And I'll do some work, but I really want to see what rural is like, because I don't feel like I can be a doctor that really understands the health needs of America without seeing the 40 million, what it's like for the 40 million people who live in rural. So he came out, and when one of his first conversations with me, he said, on my way out here, just before I came, I heard two nephrologists on an elevator talking about where they were going to go when they finished their training. And one of them said, I could move to the Midwest and make twice the money, but who wants to live with the Neanderthals out there? And he said, Ben, I hear that stuff all the time. And I came here to see what it's really like. And so what he was doing was exactly that. He was going to build relationships with people in a very different place. And he was going back to report to folks that say that stuff to him. It's actually not that way. And so I think to the group, if you can identify with some of those things being said, know that the middle of America knows it's being said. And if that was said of a race of people, that's unthinkably horrible. And it's horrible to say it about anybody. But I think there is this divide and it goes both ways. And I think we have a responsibility to build relationships with people that are different than us, learn about them, pull out the good in them, humanize them, and bring them back to folks that may not otherwise have the courage to do that initially, and invite them, give them the opportunity to go second.
I love that. Thank you. This has really been an excellent conversation. Maybe this the second time I've personally had this conversation with you both in preparation for this, but equally as fulfilling and insightful the second time. We are getting some questions for the audience that I want to throw out to you both. The first we have is how did you personally get to know people during the pandemic? Specifically, how did like getting to know people change as a result of the pandemic for either of you?
Yeah, from my perspective, my organization does work with a lot of different organizations. So we interact quite a bit with different folks. I think, much like what we're doing now, the virtual space can be helpful. I also, one of the things that I did early on after the killing of George Floyd was actually bring people together to have dialogues around racism, right? And it's a small group. You get to, basically, we set up 3 questions that we ask each person to contribute to, but you get to, again, understand perspectives of different people. So be willing to set up something where you have a conversation around these topics. And if you need a facilitator, just have collected. But you really have to be intentional about inviting people into a conversation.
Absolutely. The other question that I want to make sure that we get to as well is how do you teach undergraduate and master students how to approach this important subject and role? For either of you can answer that one.
I could take that one. I love teaching and I love being involved with students. And I think one of the things that's most remarkable about college students, both undergrad and master students, is that they're old enough to be capable to lead change, but young enough that they don't realize what's impossible. And they're just idealistic enough to believe it can change. And so I think approach them through the lens that we can live in a country where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that they are the generation that can make this happen. And speak to them as though that will be their reality, if they choose it to be. Despite the failures of our generation, it can be their reality. And because of the progress from our generation, it can be their reality, in both. And I think just speaking to them with confidence and empowering them, and with some simple action steps. Your homework is go find somebody who doesn't look like you. Go find somebody who has a different background than you, who voted differently than you, who's open about it. Go find them and sit down and have coffee. And you'll find out, maybe you learn something.
And I'd like to add to that really quickly. So Dan, thank you for bringing that up. I think our health administration programs have to, at this juncture, incorporate health equity and social justice in the context of running healthcare organizations, right? It needs to be a part of curriculums. And not just a one-off course, but understanding how strategy is impacted by health equity, how health equity fits into population health, how running operations is about understanding how process, policies, and procedures impact disparities and patient experience. These things are fundamental to running healthcare organizations, and we have to start from the perspective of understanding that in order for these leaders to really be able to effectuate change.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dwayne. So we're running out of time here, but thank you so much both for this conversation today. I think Ben's last comment is a really good actionable step that I would like to reiterate. If you could leave this coffee chat today and go have coffee, virtual, in person, with someone that doesn't look like you, maybe thinks a little bit differently than you, that's maybe one first step that we can take as allies to bring others into the conversation. And I think that's a really important takeaway. The one thing I want to do quickly just before we log off for the day is I have our upcoming events for the National Center for Healthcare Leadership. So our next coffee chat will be on Thursday, July 22nd, same time. We are still TBD on the topic, but it should be just as engaging as always. In addition, please save the date for NCHL's Organizational and Leadership Excellence Conference, a new name change for this year for our 20th anniversary. Leadership Redefined is the conference name. Similar to what Dwayne was saying, actually, we hope to weave diversity, equity, and inclusion into every presentation that's given at this conference. So we're hoping to really change the conversation around conference topics in that way. And it'll be November 15th through 17th at the Swiss Hotel in Chicago. So we hope we will see you all there and on our next coffee chat. The only other thing I'll add is that when I close this session today, you'll get a quick survey to ask how you liked this topic and event. Please make sure to fill that out, and we hope to see you next time. Dwayne, Ben, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience. This call recording will be available. I know that was a common question in the chat, so we'll be emailing it out after the event.
Thank you so much, Leanne and Melanie. Thanks for being a great moderator. And Ben, thank you so much for joining in this conversation.
Thanks, Dwayne, for inviting me in. And thanks, Melanie and Leanne.
Thank you both.
Have a great one, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.